Hey everyone, Boxspring here. I'm making a medieval fantasy sandbox called Goblin Menance with an initial focus on building your own army of NPC characters like these villagers here. The latest addition I added to the game are these apples. What I wanted to show as a tutorial today is how you can make this shake animation. So in this game, if you hit the apples, they'll do a shake, and there's a chance that once it shakes, it's gonna fall to the ground and fall out of the tree. I made this shake animation using a tween, or rather a sequence of tweens. So first I'll do a quick demo of how this works inside the Godot editor. I made this tween into kind of like a easily drag and droppable widget to make it super easy to use. You can apply this shake to any object. Right now it's applied to this apple, but you can also apply the same animation node to other objects like this arrow here. So when the arrow hits the ground, it's going to do a little shake as well. So it's a pretty useful animation widget that can be applied to a wide variety of objects. Cool. So first, let's take a look at a demo of how this works before we kind of create this together side by side from scratch. So I'm going to run this scene that I pre-built. So what we're going to build together today is just this behavior here. I'm going to zoom in a bit so it's easier to see. So if you have a player character, you walk towards an object, and then you hit the object, it does this shake animation. That's what we're looking to create. So I made this using a sequence of tweens. So the reason why I built this with tweens is because you have, one, a lot more control over the animation itself. And two, it's also something that is encapsulated and easily composable. You can take this animation node, this shake tween here, and put it underneath any object that you want to apply the animation to, and it will just start working, right? So it's much easier to set up than an animation player. Previously, I also have an animation. I also used an animation player to do this. I'll show you what that looks like in the scene that I made for the apple. So here is the shake animation. I'm going to zoom in to what that looks like. So this is how you would make it in Animation Player by defining all of these keyframes and setting both the position and the rotation of the apple to make it shake. And this is okay, but let's say, for example, you want to make the shake more violent or more dramatic. You want it to have a bigger shake. In order to modify that, you have to go in and change every single keyframe. But with this current approach of using an animation node, you can go into the script and just make some adjustments to the parameters, and that will have it change it globally right away with a single action rather than having to adjust all of these keyframes individually. And if you ever want to duplicate this animation with another object, you simply create a new instance of this animation node scene rather than having to recreate the animation from scratch. All right, so let's walk through together on how we can make this demo scene here. Let's start a new scene altogether. We'll call it tutorial. Let's create a world node. Save that. And then we'll bring over a player character so that we have something that can walk around. So let's move the player character over here. So this player character I prepared, it has the standard controls for WASD. It also has a camera 2D. I also gave it a script. So let's just detach the script here and reattach it. So the script I used is this zooming camera. I'll leave a link to a video I made earlier for how you can make this zooming camera script yourself. But it's pretty simple. It just handles mouse wheels actions for zooming in and zooming out. And that just helps us see the what's happening a little bit better so that we can be able to zoom in a little bit when we're testing this. Let's also give this a bit of a background color so that we have a backdrop to move against. So I'm going to create a color rectangle. Let's call it background. And then let's give it a color that we like. So let's see here. So let's make it kind of greenish. Something like that. That looks nice. And then we'll make this a little bit bigger. Say like this. Move this up. Okay, so now we have a character that can hopefully move around in this sort of greenish rectangle area. Let's run this scene and see if that's working. Cool, so that seems to be working. The character is moving around. All right, so the next thing we'll want to do is to create an object that we can apply this shake animation to. So we're going to create a static body 2D, and we'll call this an apple. And then we're going to give it a collision shape. And then this will be just a circle shape. And then we'll give it a sprite. And let's attach an image texture to the sprite. So I have an apple image here, apple pixel art. So now we have an apple in there. And let's make the collision shape a little bit smaller so that it fits the shape of the apple. So let's set the radius to say 3 or 4 rather. So now the collision shape is hugging the sprite. Let's move the apple off to the side a little bit. Okay, and then let's create an area 2D for detecting collisions, detecting, for example, like a hitbox or detecting whether the player is moving into the apple. And then let's give that a collision shape, and also make it circular. And this one, for now, I'll actually make it a little bit bigger. Let's say radius 30. So we'll make this kind of a bigger region. So initially we'll just kind of test out this animation and make the animation start whenever the player enters this larger area here. And last but not least, let's move in our animation node that we prepared. So I'm just going to demonstrate that this node works and how easy it is to set up before I dive into the technical details of the code itself. Okay, so the animation node is this shake tween. Oh, I attached a script instead. Oops. Detach script. Go under scenes. Shake tween. Here we go. Okay, so that's really all it takes to set this up, is to just put this animation node underneath the parent, underneath the host that you want to apply the animation to. The only other dependency to watch out for is to make sure that this host node has a sprite node called sprite, so that there is a sprite for this animation node to shake. But now we want to give the apple a script so that we can actually call the animation. So let's attach a script. Let's see here, attach script. We'll call this tutorial apple. Cool. Delete everything. And then the only script we're going to add is just have the area 2D send a signal. For now, we'll detect when a body enters the area. And when the body enters the area, we want to shake. So shake tween start. And that's really it. So let's see if this is working. Okay, let's run the scene. Zoom in a little bit. Okay. So if I move towards the apple, yeah, so that's working. That should be enough to make the apple shake whenever the player character enters into that area 2D zone. Okay, so we can easily adapt this a little bit. So instead of having the player enter the area to make the apple shape, we can change that to a hitbox. Hitbox is in the player scene is right here for me, so that's the little hitbox area 2D. Whenever the hitbox strikes the apple, that's when we want the apple to shake. So to do that in this tutorial, we just change this to area entered rather than body entered. So area, whenever an area enters, and then we just check if the area is a hitbox. At least that's my implementation for checking for hitbox for now. And then we do the same thing, shake tween.start. And this will just comment out. Okay, so let's see if that's working. Okay, let's zoom in a bit more. Okay, there we go. So whenever the hitbox strikes the apple's area 2D, that's where the apple shakes. Oops, okay. Okay, so let's take a look at how this shake tween actually works and how you can build it yourself. Okay, so in terms of dependencies, again, this is really the only dependency. It requires a parent node, which in this case is the Apple node here. And then it requires a sprite node inside the parent node. So that's the sprite here. If we want to make this just a little bit more robust, we can also move this get node function into the ready function. So ready if let's see. So var host equals get parent if host dot has node sprite host dot get node sprite host sprite. So that makes it a little bit more robust. So we won't define it up here. Rather, we'll check to see if there is in fact a sprite node for us to assign the host sprite. And we want to do this sometimes because we may want to compose this animation into another kind of meta level animation that can combine this shake animation with something else, in which case we may want to assign the host sprite in a different way. But in the ready function, we'll just look to see if there's a sprite and then assign it if there is. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of parameters in addition to the dependencies. So one of the parameters is like, do we want it to pivot from below, or do we want the pivot point to be above the apple? In this case, the default is that the pivot point is above the apple. Which just means that, let's say the pivot point is here, the apple is going to shake, kind of rotate around this upper pivot point rather than lower pivot point. In terms of the actual implementation, the only thing this affects is whether the rotation degrees is moving in a negative direction, like moving to the left or moving to the right. So it just sets R to either positive or negative depending on whether the pivot point is above or below. We can quickly see like what that actually looks like. Oops, non-existent function. Let's see. Oh, host.get node, and then assign it to host. Right, there we go. All right, so now that we have the pivot point to being below, you can see the rotation looks like this, where the apple seems to be swinging off its stem. But if we have the pivot point to being above, so let's set this to true. You can see the shake is going to look a little bit different. It's going to rotate as if the pivot point is below the apple, or rotating around its base, right? So it's kind of a upper way of upward direction of rotation. So that's the only kind of option to consider depending on what you want to use this animation tween for. I'm going to collapse all of these methods so it's a little bit easier to see. So to collapse, let's see. There we go. Okay, so I created a keyboard shortcut for collapsing all of the methods. So that's under, I think that's under project settings. But for me, I bound it to Command Shift minus and Command Shift plus. Okay, so in terms of the functions, so we just defined this ready function here. But there's only one public function, and that's just start. And whenever that's called, that's going to play the animation. And then the start function uses 3 helper methods to make this animation work. There's a function that creates a tween that makes the apple tilt to the left. There's a function that makes the apple tilt to the right. And there's a function that brings the apple back to the middle. That's the recenter function here. Each one of these functions work in a very similar way. They each would create a tween node. So I have a utility function for creating tweens. We can take a look at that. Utils. But all that really does, create tween. All that really does is just to define a new tween and add it to the tree, add it to some parent node. So going back to the tween code, so yeah, when we create a tween, we assign the parent to be just this current node here, which is the apple. So that's why we say self, and that creates a new tween object and puts it as the child of this current node, the self node here. So it creates a tween, and then it defines 2 property interpolations. One is for the position, and the other is for the rotation. So the apple will shift in its x position ever so slightly, starting from the center, which is 0, and then to a negative x position. And then same with the rotation. It'll start from 0 and then move the rotation in degrees to this r rotational degrees position here. And so initially we define x and r to be the maximum rotation, and with each cycle, each time it does a shake, we reduce this x and r value, x being the kind of x position and then r being the rotational degrees. We reduce that by a recovery factor, which is how much of the, you could say, energy we retain with each shake, right? So in this case, we retain about 66% of the energy. So that's the first time it may rotate 15 degrees. The second time it shakes is gonna go up to 10 degrees, right? So it's getting weaker and weaker each time. And then once it hits a stop threshold, it's going to stop this animation altogether and emit a signal saying the tween has been completed. So with each cycle, with each shake, what we do is we make it tilt to the left. So we call the tilt left function. We wait for it to complete. And once it's completed, we get rid of the tween that we just made. And then we reduce the x and r values by the recovery factor. And then we bring the apple back to the middle, and then we call the tilt right function, and we bring the apple back to the middle again, right? So that's kind of how it works. And with each of these functions, you define the position x interpolation, and then the rotation degrees interpolation. And when it's moving towards the edge, we want to ease out the tween, which just means that it's going to move very quickly in the beginning, and then it's going to kind of slow down as the apple reaches the edge. But for the recenter function, we want to ease in, which means that it's going to kind of move slowly in the beginning and then move quickly back to the center, right? So this way you get a more natural feeling animation. For the transition type, I put in a sine-based transition type, but you can really use any kind of transition type you like. So it's stop threshold, tween duration. So that's how long each of these tween lasts. So for that, it's 0.05 seconds. But yeah, so that's basically how you would set up this animation, and that's really all there is to it. And once you have this built out into animation node, so we can take a look at the scene. It's really just a single node object here. You can just drag it underneath any object that you want to apply the animation to. So hopefully this tutorial was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to join the Discord if you want to ask me anything more in depth or specific, or you can leave your questions in the comments below as well.